welcome to Books on the Go. I'm Anna and I'm here with a November wrap-up, just in time. It's the 30th of November as I record this. I'll be quick because I've got some people due here any minute, so there'll be a knock on the door. The first book I'll talk about is Disoriental by Negar Djavadi, which I read. I think all of these, in fact, I did for the podcast. So it's been a podcast reading month this month. This is by Negar Djavadi, who's an Iranian woman, and she lives in Paris. So it's written in French and translated by Tina Cover. Beautiful translation, and her writing is very lyrical, but it's a novel, but it reads very much like a memoir, and I think it's at least partly autobiographical and talking about her family history and the history of Iran and how she came to be living really in exile in Paris and how they had to really flee their home. And there's a moving passage about that where she talks about how she has no photos of herself as a child because they had to leave everything behind. So it's really interesting in terms of her coming to terms with who she is and trying to establish her identity, and yet she has no record of who she was as a child or where they lived. She has no photos, or it's really just all in her memories. And so part of this is her wanting to remember and get it down, I think, on paper, so that there's some record of that life. So it's interesting. It talks about the idea that to integrate into a new culture, you have to first disintegrate your old culture. And the writing is beautiful. I found it a bit of a slow read because it is more like a family history in terms of, whilst the events that happened in their life are dramatic, it's not a story with a clear plot that has sort of dramatic tension and build-up. It's more, this is how my grandparents met, and this is the story of Mirza Ali and Noor, and this is how my parents came to be living in this part of Iran, and this is what our life was like. And then during the war, this is, what happened to different people in her family, until there was a fairly major event that she sort of circles around and comes back to. So that, I found that quite slow and challenging to read, and because I don't know much about Iran, I think I found that sometimes I was confused about what was happening or who was who, and there's so many different family members. But on the other hand, it did give me a sense of their culture and of being in that country. You get there's a richness to the prose that gives you a real sense of being there. Very visual, lots of tastes and smells and textures. So she's quite a beautiful writer, and I'm glad that I read it. But yeah, quite a slow one for me. So that's Disoriental. And then another one that is, I think, drawn from some real life experiences is There by Tommy Orange. And he's a Native American. This is his debut novel, and it was longlisted for the National Book Awards. And I think that's how I heard about it. It's been very buzzy in the States, and I haven't heard much about it here in Australia. But Amanda and I read it for the podcast. It's a strong book. I didn't love it, but I'd be really interested to read what he does next. I think he's a really good writer, and it's an important book because he is a Native American. And so this is telling the story of urban Native Americans who live in a city and how things are for the characters he describes, which I'm sure are based on people he knows, and if not himself, from an own voices perspective, which is really important. And it was entering into a part of the world and a culture that I didn't know anything about, and I now feel like I have some sense of it, which I don't think you would get as perhaps as authentically from a white author. it's told from different characters' points of view, and they connect and they're related with each other in various ways. So there's Jackie Redfeather and there's Orville, and they're all sort of it converges towards the end where they go to a powwow in Oakland, and it's quite bleak. There are a lot of their lives are grim in some way. So one has fetal alcohol syndrome, another one is an alcoholic or recovering alcoholic, and they have various issues. And he tells that in an unflinching way. So I liked the honesty. I found it a bit more like a series of short stories, in the sense that each character, each chapter and different character, I did lose track of who was who or how they connected with each other. So I wasn't following it as you would with a novel, where you're following one or two characters' journey and seeing where that will end up. But it did, I think it ended strongly, and it's definitely a good one to read. But yeah, overall quite bleak, and there was a lot going on, I think, for what's not a really long book. So that's there. Then I seem to be going from the bleak to the harrowing, but this is an excellent book. This is The Last Girl by Nadia Murad, written with Jenna Krajewski. Nadia Murad she recently won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work to end the use of sex crimes as a weapon of war. She is a Yazidi Iraqi woman, and I didn't know much about Yazidis, but it's a minority religion in Iraq, and this is her story, and she talks about her family life, her life in the village Kojo in northern Iraq, and a simple life but a really loving family. And then ISIS came to their village and killed her brothers, and took her, and she was held in captivity as a sex slave, and ultimately she escaped. And so it's beautifully told. It's very clear prose and really unsentimental, given the subject matter. She doesn't dwell on anything that's really disturbing. You do have a real sense of the trauma of this experience, but it's not overblown, and the writing is really good. And so it's a compelling read, very moving, and it's inspiring, because by the end you just have a real sense of her courage in telling her story, not just because for all the reasons you'd expect if you've survived that you're feeling ashamed and incredibly traumatized, but also in her religion, sex before marriage is forbidden. So she actually has a real issue of whether she'll be accepted by her community because of what's happened to her. And so her bravery in telling the story is really inspiring, and it's a call to action, really. It feels like a very urgent book, and it's one of those things that you read it and then other things that you read just don't seem that important after this. So a very good book. It's one that I'd recommend. It's quite readable and not overly long and important. So that's The Last Girl. Then I finished the month really well, actually. I read belatedly The Museum of Modern Love by Heather Rose, and this is one that has been on my radar for at least a year. She won the Stella Prize in 2017, which is the prize for women's fiction in Australia, and I bought it and I just hadn't got to reading it, and then almost the moment passed and I've had it on my shelf this year, and it's just been released in the United States, and she had a launch with Marina Abramovich at the Museum of Modern Art, I believe, which would have been amazing. So this is the story of a piece of performance art staged by Marina Abramovich called The Artist is Present, and she sat on a chair at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and members of the public were invited to sit with her. So they had another chair opposite her, and you could put your name down to say, yes, I'd like to sit with Marina. And she did that for 75 days, and she was completely still, and it wasn't talking, it was just, you would just look at her. So it's it sounds very simple, but it's remarkably compelling. And I've also seen a documentary about Marina, which has a lot of footage of this performance, and it is so compelling and so moving. So a lot of people are moved to tears. They get really affected in different ways, and also I think at least 850,000, if not 1,000,000 people came to watch, and a lot of them came back day after day. And so then there developed sort of friendships and this whole community of fans. So a really, really interesting piece of performance art in itself. And then Heather Rose has taken that as a jumping off point, and this is a beautiful sort of tribute to Marina Abramovich, and she somehow weaves just a story in and around that artwork with characters who go to watch. And I won't say too much about what happens because I don't want to spoil the experience of reading it, but it is a beautiful, she has really honoured Marina Abramovich in a beautiful way, and the writing is very assured, really lovely, and not, it's really unpretentious writing. It's not overblown, given that it is a book that tells you a lot about art, or you learn a lot about art, or at least it provokes a lot of thinking about it. It's not at all highbrow, or it doesn't feel like an art lesson in any way, and it's incredibly readable. I think it hits that sweet spot between a book that's very approachable and readable for anyone, but is, you know, intelligent and beautifully written. So I just really enjoyed this. After the sort of couple of months I've had of fairly heavy reads, and often books that I've liked or they've been important, this was just like a breath of fresh air, because it was just it does all the things that I love about reading, which is characters that I loved spending time with, even though some of them are unlikable, and just a world that you want to escape to, a book that you want to pick up when you're not reading, you want to get back to it. And I learnt a lot as well. It's really thought-provoking. So that is definitely a must-read if you haven't already. I think I'm the last person, at least in Australia, to have read it. But I'm so glad I did pick it up. That's The Museum of Modern Love by Heather Rose. And now I will have to go. I hope you've had a good reading month, and I'll be back soon with some summer reading plans, or a December TBR. So I'd love to hear what you're reading, and you might be doing winter reading, which is one of the best seasons for reading. So I hope you're well, and I'll see you soon. Bye.